So just to give you a little background on my motivation for putting this event together, last year under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act, the government made prevent duty a legal requirement for the NHS, schools, and higher education. Prevent obviously has been around a lot longer than that, is a rather controversial topic, but now a whole bunch more people obviously are coming into contact with prevent, including having to sort of carry out prevent duties. Now, anecdotally, I've been asking around at children's birthday parties and dinner parties to people I know who work in the NHS or in schools and asking whether they've had prevent training, counterterrorism training. And you know, I often get strange reactions at a birthday party for 6-year-olds as to why I'm asking about that topic, but I keep running into people who've had training as a result of prevent. So I wanted to have a debate about prevent and whether, in fact, it is needed in the UK or not. And if it is needed, what, if anything, should take its place? So tonight, you all are going to have a really important role to play because we're going to have at least half the time is going to be devoted to audience participation, to Q&A, to comments. As I said, you'll have a chance to do that verbally. You'll have a chance to do that through writing with the cards, pens, which you can then pass forward to me or pass forward and someone can pass it on to Darshna, who will go through them. And as I mentioned, you can tweet, debate, prevent, and there's also the Facebook group. Finally, there are questionnaires as well if you have time to fill it out. Appreciate the feedback. I'll also email them out to you as well. So finally, I just want to say it's sort of my naively Canadian ideal that tonight we're going to have a passionate but respectful debate in which a variety of views will be aired and listened to, and you're all obviously crucial in making this happen. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our chair for tonight, who I was very pleased when she said that she would chair the event. So please, could you welcome Darshna Soni, Home Affairs Correspondent for Channel 4 News.
I've been reporting on prevent since it was first introduced way back in following the 9/11 attacks. And over the years, I've looked at the way that various governments have struggled to try and tackle this issue of extremism. And one of the things that I've noticed is the thing that they can't even get right is, what is extremism? If they can't even agree on a definition, then how are we supposed to prevent it? And I've seen all sorts of projects over the years. I remember back in the early days, I interviewed somebody from Newham Council, for example, and he said to me off the record that as long as I can get a group of brown people in the room and hand out free samosas, I'll get funding from the council. So those are the kind of projects initially that were being funded. Since then, there are concerns that it's become perhaps more sinister, and we've heard this viewed. Various stories that we've heard about young children, for example, getting reported for saying something very innocent and innocuous in class. So there are all sorts of concerns that people have raised about prevent. And for me, a quote that sums it up very nicely is something that we heard this week from the UN's Special Rapporteur, who was in Britain looking at the way the government tackles extremism. And he said, "None of us want to live in a country where you're not sure where the next bomb is going to go off. But equally," he said, "none of us want to live in a country where you've got to constantly look over your shoulder and watch what you say because you don't know how it's going to be used." And for me, that sums up very nicely the dilemma of the Prevent programme. Now, there are a lot of people here that I'm speaking to. I know some of you personally have been affected by Prevent. I managed to speak to a few of you before this debate started. But I also know that we've got some Prevent practitioners in the room as well, people who work in this field. And we're hoping tonight that we can have an open debate and a discussion, and people can speak freely and air their views. It's not like the EU referendum debate. We don't want to get all acrimonious and start slinging insults at each other. So as Steve said, we'll all try and be open, respectful, and hopefully have a good debate. I'm just going to introduce the panellists first of all. Just a couple of things to mention as well. Steve mentioned we've got the hashtag going on. If you could all make sure your phones don't ring, but you can use them to tweet if you can live tweet and follow the debate. The hashtag is debateprevent. I might try and tweet if you see me looking at my phone, but although I'm a woman, I'm not that good at multitasking, so I might not bother trying. At the end, we do want everyone to join in. So usually on these events, we try and rope you all in, but I know there's so many of you here that have got strong views, so I don't think we'll have any trouble getting you all to have your say. So at the end, we've got a good 45 minutes for debate, so you'll all get a chance to have your say. I just wanted to quickly ask you before we start, if everyone could put their hands up and answer the question, do you think that we do need prevent in this country? We just want a show of hands. Who thinks we need prevent? Okay, and who thinks we don't? Okay, so 2-1, I'd say most people think we don't need it. And we'll see if anyone changes their mind over the course of this evening either way. I just want to introduce our panellists then. Firstly, Dr. Imran Awan, some of you might know. He's an associate professor in criminology at Birmingham City University, and he's published a number of papers and books in the area of policing, Muslim communities and counter-terrorism. He also is a member of the advisory committee for a project that measures anti-Muslim attacks called Faith Matters. It's a not-for-profit organisation which monitors Islamophobic attacks in this country. His bio is actually a lot longer than that, but I'm going to leave it there because otherwise we'll be here all night. And then on my left, Dr. Jonathan Hurlow, who produces and chairs public debates. It's for an organisation that's called Birmingham Salon. And if you're wondering, it's not a hairdresser's, which is what came up when I Googled it. It describes itself as a public forum for debate where ideas are vigorously scrutinised and no topic is off limits. And the topics that they have debated include things like immigration, violence, freedom and happiness. So I have to ask, are you feeling happy today? Very. Okay, so let's get started. I'll ask you to speak first. They'll both give a short presentation on the issue of prevent, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. So if you'd like to start us off.
Given the often the unpopularity that we see in the press about the prevent strategy, I kind of imagine that to an extent I'm playing the role of the pantomime villain of this debate. Regrettably, that's something I get used to. I am a psychiatrist as well, and psychiatrists are often unpopular because we medicalise life events, we detain people and coerce them, and we prescribe medications on behalf of the demonized pharmaceutical industry. But I'm not going to talk about anything that my employing mental health trust does in terms of its policy for the prevent strategy. If you want to contact them, I can give you the contact details and you can seek further information. But I do think it is important to think about the lessons from my medical profession. Psychiatrists are medics, doctors, and that is that when we prescribe things, when we plan things, we are open to the fact that there can be harmful unintended consequences, side effects, so to speak. And I think any reasonable prevent strategist or practitioner will be open to the possibility that there may be unintended harmful consequences. But I think it's important to be reasonable in considering how likely, how common, how severe are these harmful effects. Now, David Anderson, QC, the Independent Terrorism Legislation Reviewer, I think alongside Mozambique Beg, highlighted to an audience that he is a critic of prevent. However, he also highlighted concerns about excessive, exaggerated reporting of possible harms, the archetypal one being at the moment the terraced house case. So I think it's important for people to be reasonable and balanced in considering the potential harms and not to unnecessarily over-exaggerate them. We could all imagine rare possibilities where a referral from a teacher to a channel panel causes X, Y, and Z, and then there's a very serious adverse event, but just how likely would that be? In my day job, regrettably, sometimes when I'm trying to help people and improve something, the thing I do makes things worse. That's an unfortunate potential paradoxical effect. It is my duty to be open to that possibility. But again, I don't suddenly stop doing anything to try to help anybody just because there's that possibility, and I look at the evidence that it's going to cause harm. Now, if it's the case that prevent is paradoxically creating more terrorist events, because that's what it's trying to reduce the likelihood of, Why is it when Simon Cole, the Chief Constable, says there's been 8,000 referrals in the last year, why have there not been then 8,000 terrorist events? And I think it's important that people also look at if there is any evidence that there are any benefits. He also says in his Guardian article this weekend that looking at a sample of people who've received channel interventions, 30% did very well, 50% did well, and 20% had limited benefit. Is that evidence that actually maybe prevent interventions can be helpful? And just because I think it's important for people to be open to unintended consequences and harms, I don't think that means we can justify inaction. I don't think lecturers, teachers, doctors, nurses, other public servants should just sit back and shrug their shoulders and say, "Pah, it's not my job. I'm a teacher, not a spy." If there was an Anders Breivik in Birmingham sitting there ruminating, wondering whether or not he needs to create mass casualties from our communities, I don't think we should feel comfortable about sons and daughters being dismembered in streets in Lahore, in Ankara, in Istanbul, in Brussels or Paris. I don't think it means that older Muslim men walking down the road in Bordesley Green should be stabbed to death and we should just say, "It's not my problem," or that bombs should be left outside mosques in the West Midlands to maim and kill worshippers. I don't think we should just be able to shrug our shoulders and say, "That's not my problem." And if benevolent public service professionals do turn their back on prevent and feel, "Oh, I don't want to get my hands dirty in trying to stop there being mass gratuitous violence," which is understandable. You know, people don't go into teaching to think about people being killed in large numbers. People don't go into it that way. I think that's reasonable for people to feel uncomfortable and anxious about getting involved in those possibilities. But I think those people need to look in the mirror and think hard to themselves. If I don't get involved in this, what fills the gap? I would say that there's other limbs to the counter-terrorism strategy, and the one which would fill that gap would be pursuit. So if you don't have civil society getting involved in trying to address things, will there be more arrests? And in all seriousness, we know that the possibility is that there may even be deaths, because it is lawful for counter-terrorism police to potentially shoot people if that happens, and it did happen in the Tube. So people have to ask themselves, am I being progressive by not being involved? Or am I pushing things actually towards the pursuit side of approaching these challenging problems? And I think we need to be quite careful there, because yesterday in Warsaw, families were convicted for going to Syria. That will be the arrest consequences. Is it the case that Prevent has enabled other people in the West Midlands to actually say, "No, I don't want to go to Syria. I thought about it, I've weighed up the options, and actually I want to stay here"? Has that happened because of Prevent in the West Midlands here? Does that mean that people haven't been criminalised? And so if you turn your back on Prevent, does that mean that you will be leading to those people being arrested instead because they made the life choice to go to Syria and then face that? Or even worse, potentially be killed in Syria? I also think it's important for us to be quite careful in considering what is the alternative to prevent? And a lot of people politicians who are like chameleons. There's some who have been around in the times of Blair, in the times of Brown, in the times of Corbyn. They're still here. And some of them have called to abolish prevent. But after that, they say, and do something else. Now I think we should be very careful about those people and wonder about what they're asking for. I would suggest that they're asking for votes and that they're just rebranding themselves, rebranding prevent in the same way that they would rebrand themselves. So I'd be cautious there, and I'd think, why do people want to abolish it? What do they want to replace it with? Are they out to get grants for research in the next new version of prevent? These are questions that I think we do need to think about. It's my opinion that the alternative that's sensible for the prevent strategy, and I think there is a sensible alternative, and I think that is the prevent strategy. And I know that sounds ridiculous because obviously the prevent strategy is the prevent strategy, but the prevent strategy isn't the prevent strategy. The prevent strategy has changed 4 times, and in 2011 there was a very thorough review of it by Lord Alex Carlisle that led to a dramatic shift from policing to local government. This is the way policies and strategies change in the UK, by review. And I would say the alternative is to have increased scrutiny, increased independence, potentially with judicial basis on a routine, regular level. That is the way I think you could improve efficacy and reduce harms. Thank you.
In terms of the prevent strategy, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Jonathan said, and I agree with a lot of what some of the practitioners here are doing in terms of challenging extremism, and I think people recognise, and I respect that of course there has to be something in place, and I totally agree with it. I think though the label that public workers would like to shrug their shoulders and not do something is not very helpful, because I can certainly tell you as an academic and with my students, of course there's dialogue, there's debate, there's discussion, but I would never shrug my shoulders and think, well, I shouldn't be tackling this problem. If there's a problem, you deal with it. I agree with that. I interestingly, just before I came, went on the Home Office e-learning website that shows you the prevent training. So I thought, let's have some fun with this today. So I had a go at it, and it says, what do? You're a lecturer. You click on the next button. But then it came to an icon that says behaviors that concern you. So then it came up with a select group of and this is one of the problems with prevent, which is a wider problem, which is this pathological state in which we look at things through risks, symptoms, and indicators. And I don't think that's very helpful. But when I went on that, it said absenteeism, signs of stress, anger, crying, isolation. And it had all these things, and it said which ones of these behaviors would concern you, in particular in respect to radicalization. So I clicked on, I think it was crying, isolation, and anger. And then it came up to the next box, and it said, but you do know that crying, anger, and isolation doesn't necessarily mean radicalization. So I thought, okay, that's fine. I get that. Went on to the next box. Similar thing happened. It came up with the other option. It said, you do know that this doesn't necessarily mean radicalization. And it got to the point where, and you can read the whole 116-page document of the prevent strategy, which is extremely vague, and I would say also in some parts extremely intrusive. And I would say that because in particular, when you look at the overwhelming amount of evidence that's coming out, there is a real fear, I think now, that some communities, and this is not just Muslims, by the way, I think what happened when I was writing about prevent at the time of New Labour, there was very much an idea that, well, you know what, this stigmatizes Muslim communities, the way in which funding is allocated through local authorities and Muslim populations, which I won't go over. But I think now, more and more, I'm increasingly seeing my own colleagues at universities and other places say, Imran, are we meant to be really having a safeguarding duty? And I'll just quote you what the prevent duty guidance says. It says, when it talks about universities, and I can't talk about the whole prevent strategy, I'm just focusing on universities now, but it says you should be able to look at changes in behavior and outlooks, anything that might be visible to university staff. Now, when I asked my lecturers, my fellow colleagues, they said, well, that pretty much means that our students have changes of behavior pretty much every day, every hour. So how are we going to monitor that? And I said, well, wait there, let's have a look at the next bit. And it says a due regard to the need to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. Now, I think this is where that vagueness comes, this idea of due regard, because the government leaves it open to you to interpret, because it doesn't want to give you that interpretation. It says you work it out. You work out the prevent action plan, you design it, you deal with it. And I think it's made people fearful. I mean, just to give you, is the NUT, which has over 400,000 members, have said, look, we're opposing this within schools. We've seen the NUS have a similar strategy. Over 360 leading community activists, people working within the sector have said, we don't want anything to do with this statutory duty. And I think this is the problem, this idea that now it's a legal duty. Voluntary, it was different. But now that you have a legal duty means that people are quite fearful and thinking, well, actually, you know what? I find that problematic. Jonathan mentioned David Anderson QC, who's the independent reviewer for terrorism laws. He has said, and I quote, there has been significant grievance within Muslim communities around prevent. Even the Council of Europe report, which was 2 weeks ago, said that the very communities you need to engage with, you're not engaging with them, and that there's a problem. Demos, just before the 2011 strategy came out, they went for the idea that, look, you just dismantle the whole prevent strategy, and they talked about various other things. The Intelligence and Security Committee, after the death of Lee Rigby, said that counter-radicalization policy in this country is not working. These are not my words. I'm not saying this. I haven't put words in anybody's mouth. This is independent people outside who are saying that these are issues. I mean, Peter Fahy, people know who Peter Fahy is, right? Former Greater Manchester Chief Constable. He said that there's a risk that we could be thought of as a thought police. And we've heard of other quotes of a similar nature. I think this is the problem where we look at radicalization not in that lens of securitized Muslims or that prism. What we've done is say, well, actually, you know what? Radicalization occurs in one specific place. It follows one linear model. Once it finishes there, somebody becomes radicalized. And I think a classic example was the report that the Policy Exchange published back, I think, in 2009, when it said choosing your enemies wisely, and it talked about the street organization, the street in Brixton that had, I think, some sort of prevent initiative behind it, and they called them Islamists. They called the Muslim Council of Britain Islamists, and even the Radical Middle Way, which was a prevent initiative, they said was a barrier to integration. So I think there's a strong chorus now out there that says, well, actually, if you want to prevent radicalization, then you don't, and I'm not going to talk about cucumbers and cooker bombs today and the various other cases, which Jonathan rightly said sometimes is exaggerated within the media, and I totally agree with that. But there are cases like Mohammed Umar Farouk, who was reading a book at university and was stopped and looked upon as being, well, actually, this is a cause for concern. And I actually phoned him yesterday, see who's on my contact list. And I spoke to him and I said, well, what's happening now, Mohammed? Where are things at? And he said, look, it's had a big impact on my life, for the last 18 months, my studies, everything. And he was really, really emotional about it. Now, we talked about channel interventions or channel referrals. Not all those referrals, as most people here, even the prevent practitioners will admit, are people who are violent extremists. They're not. We all know that. There are some people who go through that system who are not. Some may be, and I totally admit that. And you can look at various freedom of information requests, especially through ACPO, that have come up with various things about, how many people are being referred, something like 4,000, and under 18s, almost half of those, and one of those was that 3-year-old in London. But the interesting statistic in some of these referrals is that 20% out of all those figures needed the intervention. And I agree that, of course, 800 people is it. How much roughly estimates have gone to Syria? So I get the point. And I agree with a lot of the things people say about counter-messaging. I totally agree with that. But let me just finish off with what Baroness Kennedy Shaw said. And I think this is quite interesting because she was pushing James Brockenshire, the Minister for Security and Immigration, and she was trying to get him to give a response about the prevent statutory duty. And let me just tell you what he actually said in reply to her, because it's quite interesting that she pushed him to try and get to a better understanding of what the statutory duty was. And I quote, and this is her pushing him in December, 3rd of December, the nature of universities is to develop the mind. It is about freedom of speech and freedom of exchange of ideas, which is at the heart of a university. By challenging orthodoxies, people grow in ideas. Inevitably, some ideas will be bad ones, but the best way to deal with them is to debate them, which is what we're doing today. No university has created a fundamentalist who has gone to Syria to take part in what is going on there. Yes, people may have been influenced by other students, but that could happen in a cafe in Birmingham as much as at a university. And then she goes on, it's quite a long statement, but it gets to the point where she says to him, and it's quite interesting, she says to him, well, could you tell us, and I quote, what would happen she says, what would happen in the situation if an individual or a staff member declined to take part in that prevent training? And he paused and he never responded until she pushes him again. And then he says, and I quote, a charge of contempt of court and perhaps prison. And I think this is the question that needs to be asked today, is how far do you prevent violent extremism by actually breaching people's own civil liberties and breaching the very things that we argue are sacrosanct, things like free speech, things like freedom of expression. If we're going to curtail people for what they think and what they believe in, because remember, one of the key things about prevent is it's the pre-criminal space. You technically haven't committed an offence. As Jonathan rightly said, pursue can deal with that. Prevent doesn't. So in effect, you're trying to deal with people who might have. And I think this is where there's a real cause for concern and a real grave cause for concern, which is not just mirrored through Muslim communities now. As I said, when I was writing about prevent through the Winning Hearts and Minds scheme, it was very much that idea that, Muslims were stigmatized, but now I think it's become much wider. And therefore, I think, there are ways to tackle it. Jonathan again made an interesting point about, well, what's the alternative? I see that. But the alternative is not to curtail free speech. The alternative is actually to give these young people a sense of their identity and belonging. Of course, I believe that. You give them that sense of belonging. Outreach programs, and again, there must be practitioners here who are doing excellent work. And I totally say that, well, of course, there may be some good prevent projects. I get that. So inevitably, we're at the point of saying, well, actually, yes, we can have an independent review, but how are we going to assess its success or its failures? And I think that's an important step to take. Thank you.
We're just going to open it up, but I just wanted you to respond there to what Imran was saying. You were talking about public servants who have a duty to get involved. You were saying it's not good enough for them to say this is not my area. But actually Imran was saying, as a concerned lecturer, why should he have a legal duty, especially when he hasn't had training? Because one of the common complaints that we hear is that teachers, for example, they aren't trained in how to prevent extremism. They don't even know how to define it. So why should Imran have a legal duty to report any of his students' behaviour?
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say one thing was I don't think I suggested that the prevent strategy means that you should have a legal duty. I know currently it is the law that you do, but for the majority of the time that there's been a prevent strategy, there wasn't a legal duty.
You suggested they have a moral duty almost.
Oh, well, I think that's reasonable, isn't it? I think it's quite reasonable for people to think, oh, well, Anders Breivik of Birmingham comes to me and says, oh, I've been thinking about killing a large number of people in Birmingham. I could just go, oh, God, I don't know what to do. This is really scary. I'm going to run away and not do anything about it. Yeah, so I think, and well, we laugh, but actually, it is my experience that when I've come across people who are expressing all sorts of things, well, let's look at the reality, that there are homicide inquiries relating to people with mental health problems, where people have been shifted from pillar to post. Somebody said, oh, I'm going to go and kill someone. Somebody said, oh, go on, I don't believe you. It's not my problem. I'm a health professional, not a policeman. And they have killed someone. And I do think we do have a moral duty to think about what are the alternatives. And I think prevent is good in many ways, because the alternative is you just ring the police. Here, police, this person says they're thinking about telling them, well, that's not a crime, not my problem, says the police. What do you do? Prevent offers a space for considering and discussing that in a progressive way. Now, yeah, slapping legal duties on things is not my kind of an approach, and we live in a democracy, and just because there's a legal prevent duty here today doesn't mean there's going to be a legal prevent duty forever. Does that mean you shouldn't have a prevent strategy? That's not what I would say. So yeah, so I think we have a moral duty, as you put it.
And what about his point that there have been exaggerated reports and people in the media, not like us, but sometimes we get it wrong and make up stories about how bad prevent is?
Well, I think that's not helpful, you know, and I said it straight. This is why I haven't mentioned Puttra bombs and cucumbers today, because those cases, there's been quite a lot of doubt thrown about them. So I want to talk about what we know and evidence and the cases that have come to fore. And I agree, maybe there is an exaggeration around prevent, but what we need is this type of debate. We need to be able to scrutinise those working at the front line as well, and we need to be able to scrutinise the strategy, because at the end of the day, it's all well by saying, well, it's a legal duty and maybe next time it'll change. When is that next time going to happen? What's the next step? I think what's happened is the government has thought, well, actually, you know what? Previously it was around cohesion and all those strategies, but now we want public sector workers to do it. And again, this may be false, but the fact that I think optometrists now, is that correct? For those working in prevent, have some sort of duty within the strategy. I may be wrong, but there's quite a long ambit of, I think, public sector workers and people who are on the front line, like university staff members, who think, you know what, I'm actually worried what I'm going to say is going to get me into trouble. And I think if you're living in a society like that, then you've got problems.